We moved from the government and public policy think tank, and we've become the New South Institute. And the first thing to say is this does not in any way reflect a change of focus away from public policy to working on institution building in what we're calling delicate democracies. This is a term, Alan, you didn't mention it, but this is a term that Alan developed and came up with. Delicate democracy sounds awkward, but I think it's an important term. We've moved away from the notion of fragile democracies, which is a term that is deeply conceptually loaded, if you know the literature. Delicate, what I quite like about it is that delicate democracies is a sense that something's vulnerable, there's something precious about these democracies, and yet at the same time they're fragile. So I'm very attracted to that idea of delicate democracies, both symbolically but also I think conceptually as well. I think it's got a lot of promise. So the idea is that we continue to work on institution building in what we're calling delicate democracies by working fundamentally on public policy issues, and that's really the focus of the New South Institute. So why the name change? I think what's really important is it reflects a change of methodology, a shift of methodology, if you like. A growing recognition, which I think some of us have had for a long time, that South African conversations tend towards parochialism. We have this idea that South Africa is somehow sui generis, that our challenges of state building, of dealing with social economic inequality, of dealing with the legacy of apartheid itself even is somehow unique. That there is nothing really to learn either from our neighbours in Southern Africa, certainly not from the rest of the continent, and especially not from the rest of the world. There's an ongoing sort of identity crisis in South Africa, is even what our orientation was. You recall, for example, Mbeki's strong African Renaissance politics, which positioned South Africa very strongly in relationship to the rest of Africa. Then there was the move to BRICS, and somehow South Africa was a country more like BRICS, a kind of a sense of what is our point of comparison. So we think our point of comparison is with countries going through profound, purportedly, ostensibly pursuing a democratic project, but going through profound transitions, changes. Post-colonial changes, obviously, the chain move from apartheid, transitions from socialism, but also transitions from military rule. And this is what we're calling the New South. And what that does is that brings us into a point of comparison or discussion with the rest of the continent, the rest of the region, but it also brings us into conversation with South America, large parts of South America, Brazil today, for example, dealing with the legacy of military rule and military dictatorship, and also and especially into conversation with Eastern Europe and the Balkans. So that's not such a far-fetched idea. If you think of the idea of state capture, for example, state capture, as we all know, is a term which I've done a lot of work on. It's a term which overwhelmingly defines our understanding of where South Africa's been over the last 15 years, 10, 15 years. It defines or exhausts even, in some cases, the horizon of what we think are the challenges going forward. And of course, it's a term, where does it come from? Its provenance is rather unusual. We have to trace its genealogy. But of course, it's a term which is developed by a group of World Bank economists, Daniel Kaufman, Joel Hellman, and some others, studying the transition in the Soviet Union from socialism ostensibly to what, I'm not quite sure what, to some idea of democracy. And this idea of capture, state capture, a term which emerges to explain the interruption, the short-circuiting of that democratic transition in the Soviet Union. And of course, it's travelled here. The only point I want to make here, and I don't want to get into the merits of that particular analysis, I've written a lot about this, but what it does something very unusual. It positions South Africa not in relationship to Southern Africa, not in relationship to the rest of Africa, not in relationship to the post-colonial world generally. It positions South Africa unambiguously in relationship to the Soviet Union, to Russia, to the former Soviet republics, and to the Balkans. So we think that there is enormous productive value in thinking these points of comparison and thinking South Africa in relationship to other points in the world, not just for intellectual purposes, but from the point of view of public policy. There's an enormous amount of value to be gained from such a comparative perspective. I want to make 3 points today, and I want to be as quick as I can. Although I know that every speech that says they're going to be quick is usually an excuse to meander for a long time. So I'm hoping Yelena, who's right in the front here, will remind me if I'm going on a bit. I want to make a point about South Africa and democracy, the place of democracy in South Africa and South Africa in relation to democracy. I want to then make a point about democracy and government and institutions, the importance of democracy and institutions, and then I want to make a final point about public policy. So the starting point is a question of democracy. So I mentioned right at the beginning that we're working on this idea of delicate democracies, democracies that are fragile, that are vulnerable, that are precious. I deeply, deeply believe that the democratic project is something incredibly valuable, something very, very precious. And yet, South Africa, like in many parts of the world, the democratic project seems to be in crisis. We take, for example, the Zondo findings. I thought one of the areas of real innovation in the Zondo Commission's findings was the comments on Parliament. And what does he find about Parliament? Of course, Parliament as an institution is the institution that instantiates the very idea of democracy in South Africa. The democratic struggle in South Africa was precisely to establish such a democratic Parliament. It really is the bearer of all that is good and all that is hopeful about South Africa. What does Zondo find about Parliament? Well, he argues that the Parliament has fundamentally failed in its democratic mandate. Not only, he goes even further. He even suggests that Parliament acted unconstitutionally. I don't want to get into the jurisprudence around that. He makes an argument about the constitutional obligation of Parliament, which I'm not so sure whether it's well-founded in law. That's for legal experts to comment on. But his findings are nonetheless damning about Parliament's role to hold the executive to account. And he's got a whole critique of the portfolio committee system, and his critique is essentially around the institution of Parliament. I do think, though, that ambivalence around Parliament, the failure of so many of the MPs to perform their constitutional role, to perform their democratic role as MPs, reflects a much wider malaise. There has been work done by Afrobarometer. I think we have ghosts joining us. Afrobarometer has been surveying South Africans' attitudes to democracy now for nearly a decade, and their findings are alarming. Their findings are generally South Africans' support or appreciation for democratic institutions is declining fast. The sympathy towards more authoritarian modes of government is rising. So that is not unusual when you think about South African relation to the rest of the world. I think we are in a situation today where the democratic project is generally in crisis. You think of the USA, where I think the term state capture increasingly comes to apply. I'll make some very exciting announcements at the end of this presentation around our new board, and you'll hear from Pratap Banametsa, who's joined us. India today under Modi, huge democratic reverses in that country. So I think the period of state capture understood as a democratic reversal, which is what Mark Swilling and I argued in the Betrayal of the Promise report. This wasn't just corruption, this was an anti-constitutional project which set its sights South Africa's democracy. I think these huge democratic reversals happening in South Africa, the threat of democratic reversals in South Africa is part of an international tendency. So what is driving that? What is it that explains, this is what I want to say, the second point is around institutions and government. In South Africa, there's a non sequitur, I think, that goes in the explanation. It goes something like this. The transition in South Africa was flawed, fundamentally flawed. We ended up with a constitution which made all sorts of flawed compromises, and as a result, we end up in a situation of growing and widening inequality in South Africa. I keep hearing that analysis. It has a certain prestige in certain circles, especially what some might call radical economic transition circles. I think the argument is fundamentally flawed because it's premised on a non sequitur. There is the transition, there's the constitutional settlement, there's the situation which we have today of widening inequality, growing inequality, poverty, and the failure of institutions. And what's the missing term? The missing term is government. What is failing is government, and government institutions are failing. So this is the key issue that I think that is fundamental. Democratic institutions, globally and in South Africa, work or do not work on the quality of the institutions that they build and the ability of those institutions to pursue their mandates and achieve their mandates. I think for all sorts of reasons, democratic institutions are failing to realize or fulfill their mandates. And I think this is the case in South Africa. And I think this is at the heart, I think, of the fundamental crisis of democracy in South Africa and the crisis of the economy. The crisis we have in South Africa is not a constitutional crisis. It's fundamentally a crisis of our public institutions. So I want to move to the third part of this presentation, and that is around public policy. I think there are many reasons why our institutions are in crisis. One is unambiguously the legacy of apartheid, a complex legacy which we can discuss. But there are major, major failures of public policy. Enormous, enormous failures of public policy. Incredibly, this barely gets the airtime which I think it fundamentally requires. Our media, forgive this criticism, the media prefers stories around corruption and around individuals, I understand it, but so do our academics. Our academics prefer long, I think, teleological analysis. We are often failing to engage with, I think, is one of the key issues, and that is the failures of public policy, to develop good policy. And I don't mean good policy as a policy which resonates or resembles best practice from some place in the world. I mean policies that speak to South Africa's political economy, that understand or are grounded in what is possible in our institutional contexts. I think this is the kind of policy which we require. When we think about it, consider the case we have electricity today. We have electricity at the moment, but we're sitting with, we just come out of a period of 20 hours of load shedding. Well, 20 hours of load shedding plus municipal failure without electricity. We're all dealing with those situations. There are massive failures of public policy here. They are not just issues of corruption of Eskom. There are massive issues of public policy regarding the structure and the management of Eskom. For example, one of the untold stories of Eskom is the huge centralization of decision making, which used to be made at power stations by highly qualified, highly autonomous power station managers. Many of their powers and authorities were removed from them and centralized at Megawatt Park, which is the head office. When there was massive management instability within the management structure and head office, it translated as tremendous instability within the organization as a whole. There are huge policy failures. It's the same with water. One of the main areas, and this is where one of the key areas which we want to work on, and which we are working on, and where I want to end with some glimmers of important hope, is in the area of public administration. I've been writing about this for a long time. There are some important developments which I want to discuss briefly here. But for reasons associated with the character of the transition, South Africa did not interrupt the structure of the public administration as it was during the apartheid period. South African public administration was heavily politicized, largely dominated by white males. By definition, therefore, it was politicized and not selected on meritocratic grounds. Instead of interrupting that logic during the transition by moving towards what was in academic terms is known as bureaucratic rationalization, moves towards a better insulating public servants from political interference by appointing public servants on the basis of entrance exams and of excellence in skill. We chose, in the structure of our law, go have a look at the Public Service Act, Section 3 of the Public Service Act. We chose in the law, not through cadre deployment of the African National Congress. ANC's cadre deployment policies merely takes advantage of something, a hole or an open door which is embedded in our law. We deliberately chose to give powers over key administrative matters, operational decisions in government departments and in state-owned enterprises. We gave ministers and the president discretion over those sorts of decisions, and we gave ministers and the president discretion over selection, over questions of recruitment, appointment, promotions, and of all HR functions. In other words, in our foundational law, the Public Service Act of 1994, if you have a look at Section 3, we instantiated, as far as we could, political control of the administration. So when the tendency was historically to move towards greater autonomy or greater distinction between those roles, South Africa went the route of politicization. We did it, of course, for what we thought were the right reasons. We're deeply suspicious, the ANC came to power, deeply suspicious of the public service that it inherited, deeply suspicious of white male officials to implement ANC policies, and as a result, the idea that they needed to bring in their own people into government to move towards a post-apartheid society. We are living with that legacy today. Incredibly, though, there are suddenly, unexpectedly, and this is with a moment of hope, I think, there are real opportunities to advance on that agenda. In 2021, the National School of Government, operating under the auspices of the Department of Public Service Administration, published a framework for professionalizing the public service. It puts on the agenda two issues, two, I think, very, very positive issues. One is that public servants should be appointed meritocratically, and it's got a whole lot of proposals around that, the role of the National School of Government, for example. And the other one is that public servants should be better insulated from inappropriate political interference. So there's that framework document which is there, and hopefully there will be some momentum around it. I'm a little critical of that framework document, and we're doing some work. We're about to publish a response to the current professionalization framework with new suggestions, because it turns out from 2008 under Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi, and perhaps some people in this room know this framework very well. Richard Levine was one of the key authors of it. The Public Administration Management Bill didn't become an act, although except in truncated form under Minister Sisulu, became the Public Administration Management Act, which exists on the books. But the Public Administration Management Bill is an extraordinary breakthrough, I think. Geraldine Fraser-Moleketi's development. And what it does is it recognizes the distinction which the Constitution itself makes, a profound constitutional distinction between public administration and the public service. And what it says is that the public service is merely an administration within the larger public administration. More importantly, it sets out a whole set of core values, good values, which every administration must obey. Values of ethics, of professionalism, of transparency, a whole range of excellence, and it calls for a piece of national legislation to cover all administration. So, public service, municipalities, the judiciary, the judicial administrations, all administrations would fall under the purview of this national legislation. I think it's an important breakthrough. And I think the fact that it's been lost says something a lot about our politics. I think there's a lot of space to return and build momentum around reforms in three directions. One, amending the Public Service Act, especially amending or repealing Section 3 of the Public Service Act, which gives political power, all administrative power to politicians. I think we need to pass this legislation. We need to return to the Public Administration Management Act, so that to set and to establish in law the values which inform all public administrations, and we need to establish the institutions and empower the institutions to enforce those values across all administrations. One of the ideas which the French model has, for example, is administrative courts, administrative tribunals, and we need to give power back to director generals and heads of department in the administration to make appointments and to run the departments as they think is appropriate. This is the work that NSI is going to do. We're going to do it in a whole range of fields, in the public service, but also in policing. We're about to launch a major study of policing. There are people here that have contributed. Janine Rach, thank you very much for your contributions. I think I'm hearing that it's an important intervention. We're about to release as I've said earlier, a policy brief on public service reform. There's a lot of material coming out, but this is what the New South Institute is going to do. We're going to tackle the major public policy issues facing South Africa, to ground them deeply in proper analysis, in good academic research, but to develop practical, achievable policies which can work in the South African context. And we think this is the role that we are playing, and this is the role that we want to play. So that really is the New South Institute. We think that South Africa is an important global player. I know in the moment there's a huge moment of crisis and disillusion, but we remain a hope. The success of the South African Revolution, I think, remains a beacon of hope certainly for the African continent and for many other people around the world. We were, if you like, the third part of the great democratic revolution, starting with the kind of formal political revolution of the 18th century, of the revolution around equality, around working class movements, and we are part of the third great democratic revolution around equality, around questions of race, and also around questions of gender. The South African Revolution is an important revolution, and we are going to support that revolution fulfill itself and so that South Africa takes up its place in the world. But it also means that the example of South Africa is an important one for the rest of the world. There's lots for us to learn from the other examples of the rest of the world, but there's a lot for our example to show to the rest of the world as well.